In an industry that we're in and the stuff we do on a daily basis, it's high intensity. So we're losing a lot of fluid. And I'll quote Craig on this because he's halfway joking when he says this to the guys at the station, but rehydration's a big deal. And he'll say, "Yeah, if that's just water, you might as well just throw it out the window." And he's got a pack of salts in his hand,
right?
And of course, I give him a hard time. Oh yeah, you just want me to throw this out the window? I mean, come on. There's got to be some benefit to, still hydrating, rehydrating with water. But how much truth is to that? Like with what you're saying, if we are so depleted, just putting water in our system.
Situationally, it's super true, because if one is low sodium, if you're hyponatremic and you throw plain water on top of that, you can kill the person. And this is like every year, new military recruits, fraternity and sorority hazing where they're drinking lots of water, double days at football where these kids will go out and they're going to drink that gallon of water during the double day practice, and then they end up hospitalized due to hyponatremia, and some of them die. And it's a crazy thing, because you literally sound like a crazy person saying this stuff. But in one of my tabs open here, there's this paper, Evolution of Human Water. What is evolution of water conservation in humans? And it makes this case that for some reason, somehow, relative to other primates, like humans are more like a camel than we are other primates. Like we're really designed to function pretty well at running into dehydration relative to a lot of other animals. It's a really complex topic, and I'm trying to work my way through this and some other papers so I can understand it myself, but help other folks kind of get their arms around this thing. But there is kind of a reality that, depending on the situation, if the individual is hypovolemic, if they're low blood volume and they are hyponatremic, low sodium, throwing just plain water at the person is potentially going to make the situation worse, ironically. And so, this is why, again, when you folks deliver people to the ER, like even prior to that, you've got like normal saline, and something folks don't understand, like a liter container is a little bit larger than this thing. Normal saline is a 9% sodium solution. That means it's got 9 grams of sodium. That's like about 6 teaspoons of table salt dissolved in that liter of normal saline. And people in the fire paramedic service hook people up to normal saline all the time. They never bat an eye at that. But then the notion of like oral rehydration therapy with an aggressive amount of sodium, people get super freaked out about it.
How many times does a liter of fluid solve a hangover or like a
I mean, I've never been hungover, but I've heard.
Oh yeah, I've
heard it's bad.
Yeah.
The reason I said that you might as well throw water out if it doesn't have any salt in it is because I was under the understanding that if you do more than 5 ounces of water every like 10 to 15 minutes, that water just sits in your stomach because it doesn't have what it needs to get into your system. So you end up feeling like, and this is just from, endurance sports, when they're like, don't drink too much because then you'll feel bloated and you'll just have this water just like sitting in your gut. I mean, is there any truth to that?
There's some truth to that. I mean, a trickle is always better than a shotgun with any of this stuff. Water uptake is facilitated with sodium, like the co-transporters that help move water around. Water will also just spontaneously diffuse through those membranes, and then there's some active transport mechanisms that will actively move water around. But this is like, if you think about like the fraternity hazing thing where they're having guys like drink lots of water, like you can kill somebody with that. So because it will so dilute the sodium potassium ratio in the body that the nerves quit functioning and the person will stop breathing, their heart will quit functioning, and it's almost so like lethal injection is where they give people a huge bolus of potassium and the heart cramps, and that's it. The hypervolemic, hyponatremic, low sodium situation from over consuming water is kind of the same way, but it's arriving at it from putting so much water in the mix that the body doesn't have enough sodium to kind of balance the sodium potassium ratios, and then our electrical impulses stop working properly.
What are your thoughts on like prior to some sort of big event, taking in roughly like 4 to 5 grams of sodium about 15 minutes before, which increases your blood volume and basically allow it's like almost like blood doping where you would
Yep.
have more. What can you talk to me about that?
Yeah, I mean it. This is sketchy, though. I want to put a little asterisk on this. But when we get into performance athletics, people do sketchy shit all the time. When we start exercising, the body tends to downregulate a hormone called antidiuretic hormone, and it slows the amount of urine that is produced. And this makes sense. Like if you start exercising, the body's like, oh, we don't want that to go out. We don't literally want to piss our body water away. We want to save that for cooling via evaporative cooling with sweat. And so something that folks will do is to hyperhydrate prior to an event. And if you do it smart, you do it with a proper electrolyte ratio, some sodium, some potassium in it, and you drop that into your system 10, 15 minutes before activity begins. So you start kind of bloating up like a tick, like literally your body is kind of like sticking water and fluid everywhere that it can. And then just as the kidneys would really start ramping up, releasing that stuff, then the exercise begins and it downregulates the antidiuretic hormone. And so you're basically running around with more body water than what you would have had otherwise. And that can improve the hydrodynamics of the heart. Like the heart, part of the efficiency of the heart and the improvement in heart function as we start exercising is when that left ventricle fills, the heart material is stretchy. So you should think about it more like a trampoline. Like in my head, I think about like a trampoline getting distended and then boosting. And so when the heart fills, that preload actually helps to then efficiently eject all of the fluid out of the heart and push it around the body. And an overly filled circulatory system can be dangerous in that regard. But in this exercise context, there's a little bit of a hack there. The hazards with this are that some people can get some adverse events cardiovascularly doing this. Like they can stroke out and have some other like not great things happen. And then another and probably more likely challenge, but less threatening challenge, is if you get that big bolus of electrolyte rich fluid in your system really fast, can give you disaster pants. And I don't know too many people that win too many world championships when they're just shitting their brains out during the process. So that is another major concern on this. But this is where, if people wanted to play with this, and there are protocols out in the interwebs to look at, like people have kind of mapped this stuff out and figured it out. I would just, if you play with this, clearly, get a clean bill of health and all that type of jive beforehand, but map it out in your practice time. Don't like show up at your important game day and you're like, oh, I'm just going to give this thing a shot. Like that seems disastrous to me.
When it comes to retention or water retention, and I think a lot of people that we involve ourselves with use a lot of supplements in addition to everything else, and creatine being one of those things. I mean, how dangerous is that for a job like ours when you take a lot of that maybe in the morning and then we catch a fire? Or, I mean, does that have any negative effects?
No, and I mean, the creatine is interesting. Like I'm not a huge supplement fan broadly, like for the whole population. I think that there's a lot of really cool stuff for very specific situations, but creatine is one of those things that I can't think of anybody that wouldn't benefit from taking it other than somebody on like stage 4 renal failure dialysis, And particularly for the line of work that y'all are in, traumatic brain injury is a real potentiality because of shit falling on you, because of acceleration, deceleration events, and then hypoxic potentiality, like being in a fire and being exposed to a low oxygen environment. And creatine is really neuroprotective. Like there's some legit science out there that shows that let's say you were knocked unconscious and your air supply was compromised and somebody managed to drag you out, but it was a little longer than what we would like, and you were in a hypoxic environment, that creatine could buy you minutes of preventing abject brain damage or brain death relative to somebody who's not supplemented with creatine. And I'll throw a little side note out there. Ketogenic diet buys you even more time. And I'm not saying everybody in fire service should be on a ketogenic diet, but there's some really fascinating characteristics about low carb and ketogenic diets and some of the performance challenges that police, military, fire, face. DARPA has funded millions of dollars in ketone research over the last 10 years, trying to look at extreme environments like Navy SEALs that go from super high altitude, like high altitude, parachute jumps, mountaineering at high altitudes, to hyper pressurized environments where they're, they have those like one-man submersible, submarines that they cruise around in and stuff like that. They're subjected to huge amounts of oxygen toxicity pressure under those environments. And this is where some of those folks have used ketone salts, ketone esters, and or ketogenic diets to help deal with that, because it's weird, but if people are put in a hyper oxygenated environment, it can and will induce seizures. It can also make people just kind of crazy, like the brain stops functioning properly when the oxygen isn't being delivered via the hemoglobin, when the blood is starting to get saturated with the oxygen. There's some kind of wacky things that happen with that. And ketogenic diets can alter the brain metabolism in a favorable way to buy you more time. Like it basically prevents the seizures that would normally happen from a hyper oxygenated environment. So there's different scenarios where you could think about, maybe I would want to be in a ketogenic state for this thing, and certainly might want to have my electrolytes topped off and or supplement with something like creatine too. It's just one of those, like, creatine is like a commodity now. Like it probably costs you about 25 cents a scoop to do a 5-gram serving a day or something. And it is cardioprotective, neuroprotective, antioxidant. About 70% of the population sees an improvement in like kind of 1 rep max, 100 meter sprint activity. 25% of the population is a non-responder with regards to the performance side, but they still get the neuroprotective benefits and all that stuff. And it's literally like pennies a day. So creatine is one of those things that I'm like, I can't see why anybody wouldn't take it. And
there's supplements you feel like that?
Pardon?
Are there any other supplements? Like I feel like over this last few years with COVID and everything, it seems like vitamin D and
vitamin D, yeah,
like used to be, a vitamin C. Like those seem to be can't really do you much harm. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, vitamin D for sure. And the vitamin D piece is interesting, though. The main benefit seems to be vitamin D derived from sunlight exposure, or getting like a UV lamp. Like there's an outfit called Spurdy lamps, which is a vitamin D, UV light lamp. It is different getting vitamin D from ultraviolet light. It creates this cascade in the body in the production of vitamin D, and all those intermediates play important metabolic roles. And so I think if you live in a cloudy environment, like the Kalispell is a beautiful area, but we do get an inversion layer, and like we only get like 120 days of legit sunshine a year, which I get like kind of difficulty breathing, anxiety even saying that, because I really like the sun. But there does seem like when the studies have looked at, say, like COVID, severity, morbidity, mortality, and vitamin D status, there's a mixed signal there. But what seems to be the case is that the people who are getting the vitamin D primarily from sunlight their vitamin D levels correlate really well with doing well with, and this is true. Like let's not call it COVID. Let's just call it the flu. It's exactly the same story with the flu. Like severity of influenza is dramatically mitigated relative to vitamin D status and just overall like metabolic health, like being overweight, obese, those sorts of things dramatically worsen the severity of different infectious disease. I'm trying to think of another supplement, like again, like vitamin C is cool, and I think in targeted situations, melatonin is really cool in targeted situations. But when I'm thinking about like a recommendation for everybody, that's tough. That's where it's kind of like electrolytes. I'd like to see people out in the sun more because I'd like to see them get their vitamin D. And if people are concerned about skin cancer, there's some great research that makes the case that your likelihood of all cancers and all-cause mortality is dramatically reduced with safe, reasonable sun exposure. And there's an app called D-Minder, and what it will do, it'll ask you what your skin type is. Like, do you tan easily? Do you just burn? Like, if you're a ginger and you just like you're like a vampire and you see the sun and you start bursting in the flame, that it takes that. It takes your latitude, time of year, and it basically gives you a prescription for how long to be in the sun to maximize vitamin D production and minimize potential skin damage. And since I've been using that the last couple of years, my D levels are higher than they've ever been, and I actually have less of a tan than I historically have had because I only stay in the sun long enough to maximize that vitamin D, and then I put on a hat, long sleeve shirt, and then kind of minimize my sun exposure that way. And so everything in life is a risk reward kind of scenario, but I just couldn't push harder on getting vitamin D from the sun or a UV source, creatine, and electrolytes. And those things are stuff that I'm like, everybody, 99.9% of people would benefit from that. And then from there, it starts getting really specific and granular. It's like, yeah, you might benefit from it, but you would benefit from it under this circumstance. Like vitamin C, just really quickly, if you take that post-workout, vitamin C is a great antioxidant, but some of the benefit of athletic training, of working out, whether it's resistance training or aerobics, it causes a low level amount of damage to the body and some oxidative stress that the body then adapts to. It's called a hormetic response. We get exposed to a little bit of damage now, the body adapts to it and gets stronger. NSAIDs, vitamin C taken post-training tends to block the lion's share of the adaptive process to athletic training. So, you have to be really targeted in the supplementation around this stuff. Otherwise, you could end up kind of shooting yourself in the foot.
I think COVID's still fresh in our mind, and I like how you compared it. COVID's a lot like the flu and that approach, but I'm curious, just on a personal level, how did you navigate those few years? That pandemic. What was successful for you?
Oh man, trying to think of how to answer this in a way that we don't get canceled. Like canceling seems to be
Well,
going out of vogue a little bit. So one thing is, as just a little bit of background, like I'm a little bit of a doomsday bunkery type person. Like I've been waiting since around 2008 for the world to end to some regard, like financial crisis. I've been aware of EMP pulses, either natural from the sun or like a nuclear weapon detonated high atmosphere and destroying our power grid. So I've been kind of like, oh, some shit's going to hit the fan at some point. And pandemic, pardon?
Montana's a great place for you.
Kind of a little bit of the reason why we ended up here. I'm a little bit weird and paranoid that way. So, but the pandemic has been one of these things, like in the back of and I don't put a ton of time into this stuff. I'm not, just waiting for the world to end, but I've taken a little bit of hedged risk mitigating around like, oh, what if this happened? What if that happened? And the idea of a pandemic was one of those things. I'm like, oh yeah, 1918 flu, like it will happen. Those things will happen. They just happen on some sort of a cyclical event. And when this stuff first started spinning up, it's funny, we were down in Costa Rica at a jiu-jitsu camp, and I had been hearing about this SARS-like event in China, and I had checked out SARS-1 and MERS maybe 10 years before that. And those things are super nasty. They have like a 30% fatality rate, like no joke. Like if 100 people get it, 30 of them die, and the 70 that survived are really sick, like really, really sick. It's not a deal where like, I don't know, maybe I'm sick, maybe I'm not. Like if you survive, you're still laid out from it. The only thing good about SARS-1 and MERS is the variety that people catch from camels, is that they're really, really hard to catch. But if you had something that was easy to transmit and was super deadly, like that is a pretty gnarly combination. So when this stuff started popping up, like my wife and I had a discussion, like we made sure that our estate planning was in order. Like if I died, this was the plan. If she died, this was the plan. If we both died, this is what would happen with the kids and who they would go to. And if one of the kids died, this was, I took it super serious, but it was around April when the suggestion was that the solution that we had on the horizon was a vaccine. And my hound dog ears just like flipped forward, and I'm like, oh, this is bullshit. Like this can't be the only, like I was waiting for like this Manhattan Project of what are all the repurposed drugs that we can use to mitigate the severity of this situation, because this way was sold to us as like this existential threat. Like this is potentially going to cripple civilization as we understand it. And so I'm like, okay, like we're going to have a Manhattan Project type thing here when they developed the atomic bomb, and they had these teams working in different areas. Some people thought a uranium bomb was going to work, and some people thought a plutonium bomb was going to work, and nobody knew if it was going to work. And we were actually fighting real Nazis at the time trying to do the same thing. And so we had to win this gig, and none of that happened. Like what I started seeing was that any talk around like ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine or any of these other methods were getting censored online. And then there was this thing that there was going to be a vaccine with a novel technology in a class of viruses that had never seen a successful vaccine ever. Like HIV, they've been trying to do a vaccine since the 80s, and we still don't have a viable HIV vaccine. And so when I heard that was our Obi-Wan, that was our only hope, I immediately, this is coming from somebody who's like, oh, this is going to fuck us up. Like, this is going to be a huge deal. A bunch of people are going to die. I went from being that person to there is something seriously not consistent here. And then from there, I mean, but unfortunately, we were in Texas for the first part of the whole shindig. And then we've been in Montana now for, I guess, about 18 months. So, we kind of straddled the two of those with that. But I just made sure that I kept my metabolic health good, like not being overweight, trying to keep my vitamin D levels on point. We continued to do jujitsu during these times. If I felt off, then I didn't go to jujitsu. If somebody at jujitsu wasn't feeling well, they didn't come. People just did reasonable stuff, but my fear of that situation just plummeted because I really looked closely at the information that was available, and like the median age of death was nearly 80 years old. Like half of the people that died were 80 years old or older. And it's shitty to say, but once you're that old, like your likelihood of dying from anything is like 20,000 times greater than dying from any given thing when you're 20 years old. Like when you get older, like it's just the likelihood of dying from anything, like sneezing is practically going to kill you at that point. And they started looking at that stuff and started looking at virtually nobody without metabolic disease was dying from this. Virtually nobody without metabolic disease, insulin resistance, cardiovascular disease, kidney disease. They weren't even getting particularly sick. Like and the two people that I knew personally who died from COVID, they were classmates, and it's very unfortunate. One was 55 pounds overweight, a pack-a-day smoker since she was 13, and she was a great person, hilarious person, but like every social media picture she had this giant tankard of cocktail that she was always drinking, and it didn't really matter what time of day it was. And it was kind of a joke. It's like, oh yeah, man, like she's kind of half 3 sheets to the wind, like any given time of the day or night. And then beyond that, I didn't know anybody in my peer group who was even particularly negatively affected, except one person who was healthy, was lean, and this guy got really sick and had a hell of a time getting back to good health, and his sleep sucked, and his sleep has always sucked. He's a kind of an entrepreneur CEO type, and would go to bed at 3 a.m. and then wake up at kind of odd hours. And I think that is what because you guys know, like, this is one of the challenges being in any of the first responder stuff, like that disordered sleep just crushes people.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
that dovetails nicely in what we really wanted to talk about too with you is sleep deprivation.
yeah,
I'm beginning to, I mean, it's number one priority on my, I guess, health journey. Everybody's got a health journey, like, there's strength, there's fitness, there's cardio. Sleep is number one right now
yeah,
but partly because my sleep is shitty.
right.
5 to 6 hours is a good thing, and it's broken up, and it's just the habits from our job. And I think a majority of firefighters feel that,
Yeah.
anybody who's working night shift, stuff like that. It's just any, I mean, any nutritional advice that can help with that. I mean, you mentioned melatonin, right? I mean, I'm sorry, serotonin, right?
Yeah, melatonin, serotonin.
And
So we did I'm on the board of directors of a medical clinic in Reno that did, backing up a little bit, in 2003, there were 3 UNLV police officers that went down to either a stroke or a heart attack. Like 2 of them had strokes or 2 of them had heart attacks, and one had vice versa. But all of them survived, which is good. But all of them then are medically retired because it's assumed that that disease process is a consequence of the work that they do, which is almost certainly the case because of hypervigilant state and sleep deprivation and everything. And so folks started asking, hey, could we screen these first responders and find the people that are at high risk for these issues and then get out in front of that? And it took a number of years for this clinic that I became part of in 2009 to really get a good algorithm for finding folks. And we use some advanced kind of blood work testing. It's really inexpensive. It's like $150, but very, very few people use it. But between that and a really thorough medical history, we can figure out what a person's risk profile is, basically of their metabolic health. And we did a pilot study where we found about 40 is 38 police and firefighters in the Reno system that were at high risk for type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And we got these folks on a lower carb diet, which I would make the case that if you're in that shift work scenario, one of the primary features of shift work is that you become insulin resistant, period. Like this is crystal clear in the literature.
What does that mean?
And
What does insulin resistant mean?
When we're insulin sensitive, we can handle carbohydrate pretty well, and we're metabolically healthy. And when we're insulin resistant, our blood pressure tends to go up, our blood glucose levels tend to go up. The insulin resistance at some point becomes type 2 diabetes. Like, it's kind of an arbitrary definition, but most of the population that we see, and particularly people who are shift work, like they're deep into that pre-diabetic spectrum. Like my wife and I, we did an experiment for my second book, Wired to Eat, where I ate 50 grams of carbohydrate from white rice, basically a cup, and she ate 50 grams of carbohydrate. My wife is super metabolically healthy. She's kind of a stud athlete. Her blood sugar hit like about 115, 120 at the high, and then was back down to a normal, and she didn't notice anything. My blood sugar hit like 190, and I felt like absolute garbage. And I'm lean. It looks like I'm healthy, but I've got some gut issues. I have some metabolic issues where I just don't handle carbohydrate all that well. And so the shift work individual, and what we see in police and fire work is people come in young, they come in healthy, and then they just get ground down to a nub over time. They're 10 years in and the wheels start kind of falling off the wagon, 20 years in, and there's usually a lot of challenges. But that lever of eating a lower carb diet, and it doesn't have to be ketogenic, but like just minimizing the junk carbs is a massive tool in that, because these individuals just don't respond favorably to carbohydrate. And when blood sugar levels get really high it damages the heart, it damages the brain, it damages the eyes. Like it's just bad news all the way around. All of the diabetic complications that you all see when you do your calls, this is what's happening. And it's like it's just eroding your capacity to recover over time. And so a lower carb diet is a great way to mitigate that. Zone 2 cardio, like that nasal breathing level of cardio, lifting weights a couple of days a week. And then around the sleep period, whenever it is that you get to sleep, pitch dark room, cool, maybe earplugs, maybe like a white noise generator, something like some melatonin to help you, induce that sleep state. A great guy you guys should have on is my good friend, Dr. Kirk Parsley. He's a retired Navy SEAL and he's a physician. He ran all of the dive medicine concerns for the West Coast SEALs for like 8 years, but he's a sleep expert. And this is the guy that I've learned the bulk of my understanding around the sleep stuff. But he has a product called Sleep Remedy that it's got all the constituents that help to initiate sleep and also maintain sleep, because the sleep initiation is driven by melatonin and then the maintenance is maintained by GABA. And this is where like alcohol, unfortunately, really sucks with regards to sleep, because it will make you unconscious, but it interrupts normal sleep architecture. So the really restorative elements of sleep are really dramatically impaired because alcohol kind of antagonizes that GABAergic part of the brain and the whole sleep process that's facilitated by GABA. So it's yeah.
So isn't melatonin a hormone?
It's a neurotransmitter, a hormone. Yeah, I mean, we produce a ton of it in the gut, a lot of it in the brain. It's active as an antioxidant within all of our cells. Yeah, yeah.
If you start to add that unnaturally, does that mess up your body's ability to do it itself?
There's conflicting thoughts on that. Some people say yes, some people say no. Dr. Parsley is of the opinion that so long as you keep the amount that you're supplementing right around what we would produce physiologically, that it's not that big of a deal. And one of the problems that occurs is when people get in this disordered sleep scenario, you just don't produce the normal amounts of melatonin. Like inflammation interrupts things. And also, like if you're in that flipped schedule where you're awake all night and then theoretically sleeping during the day, it's very difficult to get the body to go down during the day. And this is where I think I've got them around here somewhere, but like red glasses, the blue blockers, when you are winding down for the evening, whatever your evening is, putting on blue blockers, maybe taking some of that melatonin. If you have some alcohol, try to have it as far away from your sleep time as you possibly can. Caffeine is a big deal. And this just slays people, but about 50 milligrams of caffeine every 2 hours is about the optimum to induce alertness and wakefulness. But it varies from person to person how long it takes to clear caffeine out of the system. And so this is, people are going to freak out on this, but like if you need to be alert, but you're heading towards the end of your shift, like something like a nicotine mint, like a milligram, half milligram, the hours before sleep. Interestingly, nicotine will keep you awake and it will keep you more alert, but it will not antagonize sleep. So like if you're early in your shift doing a little bit of caffeine, later in your shift, if you still need to be awake, but you see the light on the horizon that you'll be able to go to bed, like shifting out of caffeine and towards just a really low. And the problem with nicotine historically is that people will smoke it or chew or snuff and stuff like that. And the tobacco is terrible. Like it's a super potent carcinogen. Yeah.
Your clarification, you are not telling people to put in 5 Zins at 12 milligrams a piece all day long, which is what a lot of our crew does.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you're talking about all these different levels and how personalized nutrition is for everybody, where can someone go, or is there a place you can go get a blood test and then you get a readout saying, hey, you're actually shouldn't be eating this, you need more of this in your diet? I mean, I know there are some companies like Inside Tracker that's out there, but do you have any recommendations? I mean, we have, as you know, public servants, when we go to the doctor, we have a 5-minute visit. They check our blood pressure and, have a good day.
Right.
What would you suggest someone do if, like, me personally, I want to go to someone and figure out what I should be eating, where my blind spots are health wise?
That's a complex topic. Like
Okay.
a first whistle stop is this outfit called Precision Health Reports, and I'm friends with them. I'm not associated with them. I don't make any money from them. You should have some of those guys on the podcast too. Dr. Bill Cromwell. This is the same methodology that we used for the risk assessment program in Reno to figure out what somebody's risk status is for type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So Precision Health Reports, you go to any LabCorp, you get your blood drawn, and then what they give you is a 10-year risk profile for having a heart attack, stroke, or type 2 diabetes. And that, I think, is really valuable just to get as a benchmark. Like if you're a young, healthy individual, maybe newer to service, it'd be great to have that as a benchmark so we can see how the person does as they go through their career. But also, if you've got kind of a higher risk profile than what we want, then they don't tell you exactly what to eat, but they're actually pretty big fans of low carb and paleo type diets and stuff like that. And if you are insulin resistant, they'll usually recommend kind of like a carbohydrate cap so that we get some blood sugar control. I really love that, particularly for first responders, because in my opinion, like the most important thing to know is what your metabolic risk profile is today. And again, then we can use that like as a guideline for what we need to do, like lifting some weights, doing some cardio, fighting tooth and nail to get on a more amenable like sleep schedule or whatever. And then the what to do from there. I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's easier, especially if we know what the situation is. And also, again, like people start off in these police, military, fire breathing, monsters in the beginning, and the work grinds them down. And so I think getting that benchmark early so that what do you look like when you're metabolically healthy and young? And then as you get older, we at least have that to look back to it as a guideline. Like, well, we want your blood sugar to look like that. We want your cholesterol to look like this. And this is the stuff that we're going to do to try to get you back to that spot.
Switching gears real quick. I think you have been on the cusp of some of the like biggest,
like a serial entrepreneur.
yeah, like you were at the beginning of CrossFit, really the beginning of paleo. Element salts is, in my opinion, and I know that I just screaming, one of the most important supplements that you can take for performance.
A few startups too, right? I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
So like, what are you
Yep.
what are you excited about now? Like, what is that kind of next thing that you're as excited about as those other things?
Yeah, like over my shoulder, there's this sacred cow poster. I think we got it there. I wrote a book on that, and there's a lot of discussion out in the interwebs and in the world about climate change and some of the concerns around that. And one of the primary things that is held up as the driver of all these dangers are grazing animals, are cows, and it is. I hate saying it like this because it's a complex topic, and when you put these emphatic one-line statements, like I think it convinces some people and hopefully actually unsells other people, but it's kind of ridiculous. Like when you really dig into this, like if we're really legitimately concerned about climate change, and we probably should be, but if you're blaming cows as the primary driver of climate change, you were barking up the wrong goddamn tree. And so this is the thing that I've been really fired up about. And this gets out into kind of political stuff, but from like a World Economic Forum level on down, there's been this big push to get people to eat less meat, to have more of our food produced in this kind of food as IP, food as intellectual property thing, like these genetically modified, grains and fake meats like Impossible Burger and Beyond Meat and all this stuff.
People's noses off.
Yeah, and people will bite their noses off apparently when they eat that stuff. Yeah, their COO went crazy at a Oklahoma football game or something and bit a dude's nose, the tip of his nose off. But I I'm pretty fired up about that because the energy, like oil, nuclear energy, all that stuff is really, really important. Like we're looking over in Europe right now, and like they're going to have a hell of a winter because of some decisions made around green energy and climate change and all that stuff. And I think it's really, really short-sighted. And there's also a lot of weird stuff going on with food, like uh, Sri Lanka. It was one of the fastest growing economies in the developing world. And a year and a half ago, they just on a dime, they said, we're going to go 100% organic and we're not going to use like synthetic chemical fertilizers and all this other stuff. They're in like a dire food crisis now, and energy crisis, food crisis, riots, people dying. And they went from one of the poorest countries in the world to being one of the fastest growing, like wealth, like people moving from abject poverty to middle class and wealthy. It was happening faster than like we've ever seen in virtually any country ever. Now it is completely reversing, and we're looking at Europe and food security. Like the Netherlands has been tasked to dispatch like 1/3 of all of its grazing animals. Ireland has been told that a bunch of their farmers need to be bought out, and the meat production shuttered because of like climate change issues and stuff like that. So I'm super fired up about that, because I think that like if you want to control a populace, if you control energy and control food, you control the populace. And I think that I think there are well-intentioned people in that space who are unfortunately completely ignorant of economics, thermodynamics, and evolutionary biology, and so they have no goddamn idea what they're doing with this stuff. But it sounds really good. It makes you feel good. It makes you feel like you're part of, some bigger movement and team and all that. And I appreciate that, but it's also like terrible advice. And I think that it's going to horribly backfire. And so I'm fighting pretty hard to just get people to ask better questions. Like, it is the idea that grazing animals are the primary driver of climate change. Does that really hold water? Like, is that really the place that we should be looking for addressing things? And if that's not the primary driver of climate change, why is it being hung that it is? And why are we not looking at the other areas that are maybe more concerning and whatnot? Like,
I think you hit on it, is that, that's an easy, hey, this is the problem. Let's just go attack
yeah,
this side. But I think one thing that COVID taught us was the people we turn into when someone starts fucking with our food. When you can't go to the grocery store and get whatever you want, that feeling you get, our civility is pretty fragile.
right. Oh,
Yeah, and
there's a saying, we're 3 meals away from
I
chaos and revolt. Yeah, yeah, and we are. Yeah,
don't think that's too far off.
yeah.
And yeah, I loved if anyone who hasn't listened to it, the lady you wrote the book with, I'm so sorry, I forgot.
Diana Rogers. Yeah.
Yeah, your guys' Rogan podcast was
Oh yeah. Yeah.
fantastic. So anyone who has not listened to that absolutely should. Yeah, and I think you see it maybe living in Montana, where they have a much different view on being a little bit more self-sustaining and how
Hmm.
important that is. I mean, I know I feel it inside our group here, but a majority of the population just does not have a grasp on that.
Yeah, and it's a lot to unpack, and it's weird. It's like almost saying less is better than saying more. But all that I'm advocating for is that there are more farmers, more ranches, smaller food operations. More of our food should be eaten locally versus shipped here, there, and everywhere. It is the crazy thing that I'm suggesting. I think that creates a lot more economic infrastructure at the local level, and it creates a lot more food security, both locally and at larger scales. If we are completely dependent on like 2 or 3 different varieties of row crops, and this stuff getting processed in like centralized facilities and then redistributed, if one little thing happens at any one of those choke points, the population is really in peril at that point. So the thing that I'm advocating for is smaller and decentralized. And whatever side of the political aisle you're on, it seems like that should make sense. Like I can see somebody left leaning, somebody right leaning, really coming to terms with that makes a lot of sense. And Joel Salatin, who's a great guy who's been championing this regenerative ag scene for ages, like he was given a talk, and there was a vegan couple there, and they were like, well, you raise a lot of animals. What does that mean for us? We don't really eat meat. And he's like, listen, if you let me feed my family the way that I want to feed my family, I promise you I'll make enough food so that you can feed your family the way that you want to feed your family. And he's very libertarian and market oriented and everything. And that just resonates with me. Like, let's create a scenario where we all benefit, where the high tide raises all boats. And if you have different views and whatnot, that's great. And I'll honor that. But do me the good of honoring where I'm at, even though it may be different than your views on this stuff. And to just implore people that these, it's so funny because like we were told emphatically that like high fat diets and cholesterol were the primary driver of cardiovascular disease. And it was just this year, like the British Society of Diabetologists. They're like, if you're type 2 diabetic, a low carb diet is probably the best way to manage that. And I mean, it's 50 fucking years and how many tens of millions of people dead, fighting this battle where type 2 diabetes is a complex disease, but really at the end of the day, it's a process of being shitty at dealing with carbohydrate, with dealing with glucose. But yet their recommended diet has been a 60% carbohydrate diet forever. And finally, these folks have just been beat down by the abject failure of this thing to say, well, it actually looks like it's safe from cardiovascular disease. It actually seems to put type 2 diabetes into remission, it's at least on a symptomology basis. So when people talk about like, follow the science and stuff like that, you have to be really careful with that. Like it's a pretty complex topic. Yeah.
Thing. But I mean, two things can be true, right? Fact, the way that we're doing our farming right now is awful, but it's not necessarily the animal's fault. It could be that these big corporations just want to, every single year, they just have to keep making more and more money. You can have kind of both those things.
Absolutely. And just to dangle this out there, one of the main challenges of like the meat production side, and one of the reasons that it is so broken, is that there's a monopoly on processing, on slaughter and butchering and processing. And it is shockingly difficult to get like a slaughter facility up and going, and to get all the FDA anointing and whatnot. And part of that is that you want that to be a well-run process. You don't want that to be a slapdash process. But it's also clearly become this political monopolized thing. Like the big players will actually buy the time at these processing facilities at key parts of the year. They won't even put animals in there, but what it does is it makes it impossible for the local people to get access to the processing. So hunters and other people who have, maybe they run 20 or 30 head of cattle and they want to get something processed and their local outfit is booked out. Oftentimes it's booked out, but empty, because the big processors will just buy that time, so that the small time operators are like, well, I don't even want to do this anymore. And then they get acquired by the JBMs or, the whatever the big players are. So Senator Tom Massey put out this thing a couple of years ago called the Prime Act, which is trying to make it easier to have state level and county level oversight of slaughter and processing, and like there's crazy things, or there are places that like they're supposed to have a 3 1/8 inch drain pipe in the floor for cleaning this stuff, and it's a 2.78 inch thing. So it's like, nope, you can't go. And it's like, oh, give me a break. Like every other thing is on point. It's ridiculous stuff, but this would allow for more localized slaughter and processing. And this is really it's kind of knuckle dragger stuff. Like people don't get excited about it, but if you fixed this, then animals potentially are driving 5 miles for slaughter and processing instead of 1,500 miles for slaughter and processing. And
Well,
if something goes wrong at one of these facilities, like we saw this during COVID, like the workers got sick and
Smithfield,
pardon?
the Smithfield
Yeah,
plant.
like the Smithfield deal. Yeah, like a huge chunk of the country's food infrastructure was kind of jammed up because of that one thing. So it sounds crazy, but it's kind of like if you're an army and you want a choke point of a pass, they've created this choke point at slaughter and processing. So this is one, like, do you want the animals treated better? Do you want more food access? Do you want more transparency? And I'll just throw this out there, like with not Bitcoin specifically, but like blockchain and whatnot. There are ways that we could track an animal from birth to death through the whole process using blockchain, so you know exactly what its handling and story was, and it would make it completely transparent as to what has transpired with the animal. Whereas right now, you don't know what the hell has happened with any of this meat, and like any given piece of hamburger that we eat right now can have up to 600 different animals' protein mixed into it. And if you had one mistake in butchering that animal and it gets some feces in it, this is where like you get these E. coli breakouts and everything. Versus if you have a small operation, you can set it up so that like the package of hamburger you get is from one animal. And if that's contaminated, that's one thing. And again, using blockchain methodology, you could isolate it to that, know exactly where it came from, who was working at that time, do a retro analysis of what was happening, and then fix that process. Like we have these amazing tools at hand that we could just dramatically improve the quality of our food, the system. Whether you eat meat or not, nobody should feel good about like an animal being treated poorly and having a shitty existence before we get the benefit of eating it. But you could dramatically improve this stuff. And so
Oh, I
this
love.
is this is the snowball into hell that I've been working on, because I don't know how I'll ever get paid for any of this, because there's nobody like just I mean, diet books are hard enough to sell, like Sacred Cow.
It's you, bud.
Yeah, but at a point in my career, like I can kind of do some of this elective stuff, and I feel like it's my legacy play to just get people understanding that there are other alternatives out there, and it's not just gloom and doom. It's not the end of the world, whether we're talking about climate change or food security or any of this stuff. The main thing that will fuck things up from this point is if we hamper economic progress and technological progress, but also understand that we need to work more closely with the natural world. Like this is the funny thing, like all the Silicon Valley tech people think that the idea of like meat in a lab is a good idea, but these guys have never spent a moment on a goddamn farm.
Is there anything else you want to that you'd like to hit on? I mean, that was all.
No, other than the greatest joy that I've ever had in my career, and I've been able to do some cool stuff, but is working with police, military, and fire. And it's the cool thing is that you all oftentimes, not everybody, but oftentimes take your fitness and your health as seriously as a professional athlete. And God bless, folks in professional athletics. Like it's really cool, but adults getting paid huge amounts of money to play kids games is sometimes kind of ass chapping to me, and not really that interesting. And as a group of people to work with, I've never found them that interesting. Whereas working with police, military, and fire, like I always love it. Always love the group of people. Always love the commitment and the fact that your fitness is determinant as to saving your life, saving other people's lives. Like it really matters then. Whereas like somebody who's a stud athlete, and it's cool if I can keep them in their career maybe another couple of years and they make some more money and everything like that. That is super, super legit. No, not taking anything away from that. But our first responders have the toughest jobs in the world. They just do. And so whenever I get a chance to serve this community, like I just love it. Like it is absolute treat for me. So it's an honor being able to chat with you guys. And if you want me to come back and bring down property values again, I'd be honored to do it.
Thanks, Rob. I appreciate it. Yeah, you should know that after. I mean, every day we're using Element, but it's cool. We're starting to add it to our rehab. So, come out of a fire, you go and kind of dump your gear, cool down, and we're using your salts to make sure that we can get back into action faster. So thank you.
That's cool. I mean, and the one good thing about athletic environments and looking at this for insight, it is a more controlled environment. So there is something that's interesting about that. And I'll say one of the biggest things that we see out of athletes is if they get on point with their electrolytes, their heart rate variability score, their recovery score dramatically improves. So I think what y'all are doing is spot on. And I mean, you can't start stacking up that recovery soon enough. And particularly because you don't know when the next gig is. Like an athlete knows, oh, I've got a game in 2 days or 2 hours or whatever, but you guys don't know when the next bell rings.